think the first groups of questions are from Double Think. So would please like Tim or Harper would like to express your questions directly? Would be that okay? Tim be the first, and Andy be the second, and Harper be the third.
Sure. Hi, thanks very much for joining us. My question's about whether Russian propaganda has a particular target audience in mind. For example, in the news.
Excuse me, Tim, would you please briefly introduce yourself and then ask your question?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, my name's Tim Niven, research lead at Doublethink Lab. We look at a lot of PRC propaganda, and one of the things we are looking at the moment is target audiences, and particularly we're interested in the demand side for propaganda. And so my question kind of connects with that, which is about whether Russian propaganda has particular target audiences in mind. Thanks very much.
Tim, hey, good to meet you. There are absolutely target audiences for Russian propaganda, but they vary from country to country. I'm going to touch on the US because that was the question that you originally asked, but this will be different in every region. So in the US, they generally target specific communities. One is conspiracy-focused communities, particularly communities who promote the QAnon conspiracy or the anti-vaccination conspiracy. We see them target that with messaging about biolabs and about the origins of COVID, which I know from my conversations with Summer is something that she's also seen on the Chinese side. We've also seen them target what is essentially the anti-imperialist left in the US. So these are people and communities who oppose American imperialism, but generally don't look at imperialism worldwide. And so in the past, that is a group of people that have been very susceptible to Syrian propaganda and is now susceptible to anti-Ukraine propaganda as well. On a bigger scale, we see some promotion of Russian conspiracy theories in the US by bigger media figures. Tucker Carlson is somebody who has been a leader in this. He's a host on Fox News. And he is somebody who has been taking a pro-Russia stance since before the invasion and has continued to do so after the invasion. We've also seen several lawmakers echo that as well. We've also seen some targeting of communities of color, particularly with messages about Ukrainians being a racist nation or Ukraine having large neo-Nazi elements, particularly Ukrainian refugees being neo-Nazis, all of which is of course extremely false. But hasn't had a lot of pickup in terms of how many people believe those narratives. But that is another narrative that that Russia has been pushing within the U.S.
Thank you. 我想第一组问问题的都是民主实验室。那刚刚 Tim 问了第一个问题之后，就是 Jane 在解释俄国的不实讯息有哪些种类。那接下来我们请 Andy， 就是也是民主实验室的 Andy 来问第二个问题。
Hi, my name is Andy. I'm Doublethink Labs backend engineer. I would like to know that Ukraine has built a Telegram bot for people to upload any fact or evidence to just like something like a report for the Russian attack, just like as a supplement that cannot be reached from information that cannot be reached from internet. But I would like to think how to fact check for these informations, because Russians maybe get into that bot and upload some false information for it, and maybe upload a lot of junk information or spams inside it, and how to prevent these to paralyze the whole Telegram bot system. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And I was thinking about this when you asked it in the chat earlier. I think a few things to say here. One is that I use the example of the Telegram bot, but it's not the only project that has existed like this. There's another project called Comprova. I just typed that name into the chat. And that was a Brazilian fact-checking project where several newsrooms created a WhatsApp channel that people could forward WhatsApp disinformation to, that they then verified or debunked. So there are many projects like this, and in answering your question, I will also say that I'm not an engineer, and so I'm not 100% sure how they are approaching the idea of filtering out spam. From my understanding, there can be a few approaches to this. One is, IP-based. If there's the same user sending something over and over, they can be blocked. When I have done this on an individual level, not on a big nationwide level, when I've invited these contributions, I found the level of spam to not be as high as I expected. This, of course, is very different in a situation like a war or a revolution where really it's very adversarial. But I would say that I am convinced that that is something Ukrainian authorities have thought through. I don't know what their approach is.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
It's okay. And Harper, would you please turn on your microphone and introduce yourself first, please?
Okay, thanks, Summer, and hi, Jane. This is Harper, the digital intelligence analysis affiliate with the OSINT Lab, and what my work is focusing on the PRC information operations, especially what their patterns and the content producer, amplifier, or even the target audience. And one of the things I'm curious about the difference about the PRC's strategies and the Russian strategies. And one of the things I want to ask you to, how about any observations about the local influencers or entities, maybe related to the individuals or media? Is there any kind of the type of significant influencers in Ukraine? Because we observe the PRC strategy that they have some media information ecosystem to coordinate with their state media, or some commercial influencers, or some politicians, no matter in the PRC or in the Taiwan. So I want to know about what's the situation in Ukraine. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for your question. And you're asking a very important question because local influencers are playing a key role in how Russia is spreading its propaganda message about the war. So one most important thing that they're doing is they have bloggers and journalists who are embedded with the army, who are producing content that is pro-Russia, but they're saying that they are independent. So these are people who travel with Russia, and usually you're able to see their videos posted to YouTube, to TikTok, to Instagram, and sometimes they're even funded on public channels like Patreon or something like that. So they're funded by donations. The way you're able to see them is, I've noticed this pattern where when Russia takes over a city, we saw this in Mariupol, for example, it waits for a little while, and then there is a rush of this influencer blogger content that comes in and creates that content from on the ground. This is not just in the Russian language, it's also in the English language, from my understanding in the Italian language as well. I'm limited to how many languages I can track. But that is something that is a consistent pattern that they've used since 2014. The other thing is they really go for niche local media. So people like Tucker Carlson are really not very common in each country. Instead, what they're doing is they are granting interviews to local bloggers that are either very far on the left or very far on the right, or specifically target conspiracy communities. And they say, here is a blogger who has an exclusive interview. So one good example of this, I have not published this research yet, but you can look at it as well, is the woman from the maternity hospital in Mariupol. She was an influencer, and after she and the hospital were bombed, she either went or was moved to Donbass, which is a region that's occupied by Russia. From there, she gave an interview to a Russian-speaking blogger, pro-Russian blogger, an Italian blogger, and a German blogger. Some of them were more popular than others, but all of them were presenting this as an exclusive in their own countries and their own regions. And so you can look at the way that the information went from there. So they're not trying to convince an entire country that the war in Ukraine is correct. They're trying to go from the bottom up and take a more grassroots approach.
Thank you. And I think the next one is our friends from Hong Kong. And Chongjian. Chongjian, would you please turn on your microphone and ask your question?
Actually, I found it from this file after you shared. My name's Hong, so I'm more concerned about the issue. So I just managed to find the link in Thread already. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Chongjian is the founder of Litecoin, and he is in Hong Kong now. And Chongjian, would you please just share your ideas after you having the speech from Jane?
Yeah, it's very informative, and actually, it's the first time I learned about the Twitter account of that one from Hong Kong. I'm a little surprised how ignorant I am. So I think I should have known better. Earlier, and I'm still wondering whether those people are local Hong Kong or I don't know. I'm just not aware of like a group of people doing this meaningful stuff being a few years.
So I can give you a little bit more context on that if that's helpful. From my understanding, this was based from a Telegram channel that really sprung up around the protests. There were some American expats who lived in Hong Kong there, as well as some people who were from Hong Kong doing this information in a crowdsourced kind of way. I'm not sure if they still do it because of the situation in Hong Kong now. So I don't know if this was a one-off situation or if this is something that was continuous. But if you send me a message, I can send you a little bit more information. I spoke to them at the time, and I'm a little bit familiar with how they were putting it together.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Okay, and I think we have different groups from different groups from our audience, and the first group is from information security team and like a digital inventor like Gao Chongjian, and also I think the other big groups is the teachers, high school teachers and university professors. So the next question will be raised by 陈瑞南老师. Okay. 陈瑞南老师 is the high school teachers, and so please, 陈瑞南老师, would you please introduce yourself and ask your questions?
Okay. Hi, Jane. Hello, Summer. I am Chen Ruinan. I'm a high school teacher. I would like to ask a question. As a high school teacher, what is your advice that I can teach my students to fight against the disinformation from China? Thank you.
That is a wonderful question, and I know that both in Canada and the US, teachers have been thinking about this problem as well. So there are a few things that you can do. One is help them understand how news media works and how journalism works, so that when they read a story from a news outlet, they're able to understand what is a legitimate news outlet or what is not a legitimate news outlet. I will also tell you to Google the SWIFT method. This is, SIFT, not SWIFT. Pardon me. SIFT method. This is a fact-checking curriculum that was developed by Mike Caulfield, who works a lot with high school students and developing student-based curriculums. It stands for Stop, Investigate, Fine. I'm sorry, I forgot the last two, but it is meant to get students to stop when they look at the content, find other information, and figure out how to verify it in a way that is proactive and that uses almost the same online investigations methods, but obviously on a smaller scale. So I would say yes, teach them how journalism works, and the SIFT method it might be helpful to you as you teach the curriculums to the students.
陈瑞南老师 is the animal agriculture, and he teach animal agriculture, and he always help us to debug the misinformation about the animal agriculture. And thank you, 陈瑞南老师。所以Jane 给中学老师们的建议就是要教中学生们怎么像查核记者，像记者一样的思考。那同时 Jane 也提供了一个就是 SWIFT 的这个方法，那也许我们之后查核中心可以来找一下更多的讯息来整理给各位老师。And I think one of our other group is from the university teachers. So the next one will be 陈柏良老师。陈柏良老师 would you please introduce yourself and ask your questions?
Okay, so thanks for Summer and thanks for Jane. Today you have a very, very wonderful speech and give me a lot of insight and very thoughtful ideas. So thank you so much. Right now I'm serving in the National College of Innovation and School of Law in National Chengchi University. So Ukraine wars and about, especially for the information wars, I really appreciate all your work, and your attention on this one. You give a very good sample for all the scholar and all the human rights defender try to understand how do we defend ourselves. So I really appreciate all your work. So actually, there are two questions in my mind. The first question is about I saw some news to talk about how do we do the fact check, especially for the prisoner of war, whether that is a true prisoner or not. And I know sometimes both sides use the facial recognition technique, try to identify or recognize such kind of news is true or not. But however, in the legal perspective, especially according to the European Union, right now they have a draft about the Artificial Intelligence Act. They try to narrow down the scope of facial recognition without warrant. Usually, the government or the private sector cannot use the facial recognition to do the surveillance or something. So I wonder, so right now it's a huge debate, because usually when we talk about try to narrow down the scope about the facial recognition, usually we talk about the criminal justice system, but nobody talk about the war context. So I wonder how's your view and perspective to see we expand such kind of facial recognition technician to the work context, because we have a further worry, because if we open such kind of gate, that means probably both sides. Usually next time we'll use the facial recognition to do the micro targeting. It's not for the information micro targeting. It's use a gun or bombing to do the micro targeting. So that's my first question. And the second question, right now I really appreciate you talk about one slide. You talk about the war criminals, especially you not only do the fact check, you also think more. We think one step further. So if one day, if it is possible, we can use such kind of facts to be the evidence and send someone to the International Criminals Tribunal or International Criminal Court. So, but as a defender or a lawyer, when I practiced about 10 years ago, we know the crime of the war, crime of the against humanity, or crime of the genocide is very hard to prove. So I wonder, in your team, do you consult any legal experts to think about all your data and all your documents you collect, whether it's possible or is it probable to use such kind of data to be the further evidence in the future to be the legal document and to sue someone in the international tribunal. Okay, so that's my two questions. Maybe that's too long. Thank you. But I really appreciate all your speech. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your questions, and you raise very important points. On the question of facial recognition, I don't have any special information about how the Ukrainian government or Ukrainian authorities are using facial recognition, but we do know that there have been reports that they are using it. Generally, they say that they are using facial recognition to identify Russian soldiers who have been killed in action, to be able to inform their relatives that they were killed in action. Beyond that, we are not sure, and you're right that it's a difficult question because facial recognition technology is badly regulated. And whether or not it should be used at all, it is already being used, but how it can be used, I think it's a different question. So I think for us as academics, researchers, or investigators, we need to try to understand our own ethical boundaries with that technology. And what we are or not willing to use that technology for. For our team, I personally have never used facial recognition technology beyond open source websites such as Find Clone, or using reverse image search to try to match who I'm looking for. But specialized problems like programs like Clearview AI or anything like that, to my understanding, is out of the ethical boundaries of most newsrooms. To your second question, in terms of gathering evidence and it being presented in court. So my team does not work with lawyers, but our team does more disinformation work than war crime investigation work. But from my understanding, this evidence has been presented, this type of evidence has been presented in various courts before. And currently there are several organizations that are working with several courts to make sure that they are preserving evidence in a way that allows for it to be admissible to court. In the presentation link, I think it's in the chat somewhere, I gave you a link to something called the Berkeley Protocol. The Berkeley Protocol is basically the gold standard for preserving online evidence, and we'll be able to give you more information on what is legally admissible or not admissible. Basically, something that we need to think about when we gather evidence, one is that a screenshot is very easily manipulated. So a screenshot of something likely will not be admissible to court. However, an archive of it that preserves metadata, that preserves the original content, that is much more likely to be admissible to court. And the third thing that International Criminal Court representatives have spoken about is that this open source evidence cannot be the only evidence that is admitted to court. It must also be combined with eyewitness accounts. So that is the short answer. The Berkeley Protocol link, I think, will be able to help you a little bit more. And I would also encourage you to look at the work of Alexa Koenig, who has been doing a lot of thinking and a lot of work around this as well.
Okay, thank you. And Professor Chen Boliang, do you have any more questions?
Okay, I think that's a very good answer. So thank you, and I really appreciate and encourage you to move forward and go ahead. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay. I think next group will be fact checkers from our teams, and there are some questions from our fact checkers. Would Andy Xian, would you please ask your questions?
Hello, I'm Andy from Taiwan Fact Checker Center, and I want to know, as a scholar, what is your advice for media literature during the peacetime? And also, how do we communicate to the public during the wartime? And I also want to know, Taiwan is a democratic society. Some pro-China could be a political option for us. And political parties, celebrities, and the citizens can support us to unite with China in the future. How do Ukraine fight against disinformation but avoid damaging democracy? Thank you.
Not a small question. Thank you for that. The question of how you communicate to your audiences, I will answer that first because it's a little bit easier. I would say go to the platforms where your audiences are. So one of the big successes of Ukraine's fight against disinformation has been being able to work on every platform. So for the war in Ukraine, that is TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and Telegram, of course. Those are all places where you will find accurate information and where you will find Ukrainians talking to various Western audiences, as well as Ukrainian news outlets talking to Western various audiences. I'll also add that many Ukrainian news outlets have either launched English language editions or have increased the English language output of their reporting. And the reason for that is because as important it is for journalism inside Ukraine to spread, translating that journalism into English helps Western audiences understand what's happening on the ground from the perspective of Ukrainians, not foreign correspondents there, and continue getting support, empathy, and understanding from English-speaking audiences. In terms of damaging democracy, I think for Ukraine, that is a very big question. You could probably write a whole book about it. Ukraine is a very young democracy, only 30 years old, really, and it is still trying to figure out how it can be a very proactively democratic country. Although Ukraine has always had free elections, and of course our revolutions had made sure of that. I would say that there are important things to consider, particularly for fact checkers. And I think that Ukrainian fact checkers have done a really good job of this, which is that communication that comes from the government needs to be kept separate from communication that comes from independent media outlets. Yes, we can of course engage with the numbers, that or the data that Ukrainian government gives out, the statements that Ukrainian government makes. But at the same time, the media needs to do its job and investigate, fact check, and make sure that everything is as correct as it can be for our audiences. So making sure that the journalism stays as reporting and government media stays as government media is a really important separation. I hope that's helpful. I hope I understood your question correctly.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
And Mary will be the next one.
Hi, Jane. I'm Mary from Taiwan Fact Check Center. I'm also a fact checker. And as you say, the way that Russia conduct propaganda and spread disinformation is going through especially government officials and some celebrities, also news media. But as a fact checker, we know that it's very difficult to debunk disinformation, especially from government. So how does the international visual investigation team to monitor and debunk them? And what is the difficulty they meet?
Yes, unfortunately, the difficulty you describe is always going to be present. The reality is that frequently disinformation reaches much wider audiences than fact-checking or debunking. This is where the media manipulation life cycle that I spoke about in my presentation might be helpful. It is a way of presenting information that is not necessarily saying this is true and this is false, although of course that's part of it. It is outlining the ecosystem at large. And so looking at not just whether what a politician said is accurate or inaccurate, but investigating what kind of effect that has had can make for a much more compelling and much more impactful way to present this information. The other important fact is it is incredibly important to debunk disinformation, because what it does is it fills information voids, right? So when somebody is searching for something and they need an answer, your fact check will come up, your accurate information will come up. But equally, it is important to have good, accurate reporting of what's happening on the ground. So with the example with Bucha, for example, where Russian officials proactively spread propaganda and misled the public about what's happening, part of the reason why audiences understood that the Russian government was lying is because of the journalism that took place on the ground. People who spoke to the victims, people who collected photo and video evidence, and people who wrote many stories about it. So the combination of reporting and fact-checking is something that has been generally quite effective. Although I will add that we are only on day 104 of the war now, and that is still pretty early on in the war. So it has been effective so far. We hope that it will continue to be effective, but we will need to keep an eye on the situation as it develops, because what happens is particularly Western media attention recedes, and that creates a real opportunity for propagandists. We hope that that does not happen, but again, 100 days is very early for the war, for a war of this size. So that's something we will have to keep learning from.
Thank you. It's very helpful.
And Jane, it's another sharing and a question from Claire. And Claire, would you turn on your screen and say hello to Jane? And Claire is our deputy chief editor. And Claire once said she was so impressed that about your sharing, and you say because the fact checker and the visual investigator need fact check the terrible screen, especially that of death, and so that will bring us the second damage. And as his experience, based by her experience, those kind of films will make us pretty exhausted and even feel very hopeless. So the taking some rest will be very important. So during this time, do you have any fact checking or any kind of this work makes you feel pretty depressed or pretty feel upset, and how did you go through with that? And would you like express or give us some like inspiration or some share your experience?
Claire, thank you so much for that question, and I'm really glad you asked it, because the mental health aspect of this work is really important to talk about. So first, some practical tips. One is don't look at disturbing content that you don't need to look at. This means if you're not investigating it or if you're not fact checking it, try to not expose yourself to it. I would also say turn off the sound on videos. because sometimes sound can be just as traumatic as images can. So unless you are listening for a specific detail, try to do it without sound. On any apps that you're using, if they're auto-downloading images or videos to your computer or phone, turn that off or put them in a specific folder to make sure that you're not accidentally exposed to them as you're scrolling through your phone. Beyond that, there are a few other things that I do personally that have been really helpful to me. Yes, this work is very upsetting, particularly when it's about your home. The few things is, one is it's very important to stay healthy. It is very important to remember to eat, and I know that that is a very basic advice, but when something this big happens, you forget to take care of yourself. So eat healthy. Exercise is very, very important. Try to keep work, if you work from home, either out of your bedroom or in a separate space if you can, so that you can exit that space. The other thing is, of course, try to get as much fresh air and go outside if you need. To the best of your ability, speak to your coworkers if there's something that is particularly difficult for you. If there are videos that you guys are investigating that are particularly graphic, flag it as graphic and say, just so you know, be prepared, take care of one another, make sure that your coworkers are prepared for what you're doing. I would also say, look out for signs that you're in mental distress. Sometimes they're difficult to see. Those signs can include increased aggression to people around you that is very sudden. They can include withdrawal from your community, so not speaking to your friends or family or not wanting to engage with them. They can include increased substance use like drinking or smoking, and they can include lack of sleep. And if you're exhibiting those signs, tell your coworkers that you need a day off, and try to be as far away from technology as possible to allow for your brain to reset. I know that this is all very basic advice, but it has been very helpful to me. I've also put in the chat the name of a center that works a lot with reporters in traumatic situations. It's called the DART Center. They come into newsrooms to give trainings. They also have a lot of resources on their website that you can utilize. I think the first stage is understanding that this happens. The second stage is taking care of yourself when it does.
Okay, thank you, Jane. Thank you. That's very, very important to us. And I think Mary has a following question with Claire. And so I think Jane has already answered that, how to turn off our brain during the war time. So
I will add one thing to that, which is you are doing difficult work. And it will be difficult. And so sometimes you're not going to be able to turn off your brain. But it is very important that you're to remember that you're contributing to something that is making a difference, that you're not one person doing this, that you are part of a team, and that you're part of a team that is part of a bigger effort as well. So that is something that helps me. Expect for it to affect you. If it did not affect you, it would not be human, right? If these images did not make you feel bad, you should be worried too. It's okay to feel bad. These are difficult things. Just remember that you're doing this work for a reason.
Thank you. And the next question is from journalist, and Yoru Zoe Lee is the journalist of Reader, and the Reader. Hi, say hello to Jane. Zoe, we can hear you, so you need to turn on the microphone.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, Zoe, would you like let me translate for you, or you want to ask the question directly?
Would you translate? Thank you.
Okay. Just feel free. Zoe says, thank you for sharing, Jane. I am the journalist from Reader. I'm the data and the Reader is the media about the data journalism. And our team writes 3 articles about the misinformation and the propaganda from social media about the war. And we do appreciate listening from your sharing. We do appreciate your sharing. So I would like to ask, the OSINT community has already debugging, has a lot of projects and experience to debug the misinformation during the war. And do they have something in common? Like when you introduce the Syria and the Yemen and the other war, do misinformation among those wars has something in common? And also the Zoe has already shared their 3 articles, so you can read those articles in here. 那请大家可以，就是幼如已经把 Readers 这个团队在乌俄战争里面的3篇文章都分享在这个留言区。那大家也很欢迎，就是可以读这3篇文章。那 Reader 的话，他们是跟其他的媒体都不一样，他们是专门做数据新闻的团队。所以这段时间，其实 Reader 非常关注 misinformation 方面的讯息还有分析。那所以幼如是想要知道，就是在战争有没有OSINT 团队已经做过很多的查核，那是不是这些不同的战争之间有共同点呢
？Okay. Thank you for your question, and it's a little bit difficult to answer because there is really no country that has not been affected by disinformation. And of course, each situation, each country is different. There are a few things that I think are important for us to keep in mind. One is that disinformation comes after a breaking news event, after a big event. So if we think about COVID, for example, there is disinformation on that topic. If we think about Ukraine, there's disinformation about that topic. More granularly, we see disinformation after particularly terrible attacks. In Syria, we saw a big flood of disinformation after there were chemical attacks. In Ukraine, we see a big flood of disinformation after there are attacks on hospitals or in Mariupol. Of course, the reason for that is because that is when there is the most people online. There is the biggest audience. And so disinformation has the biggest chance to hang on. The other thing is that with many of these narratives, as I've already mentioned, it is not a person suddenly deciding that they will spread pro-Russia disinformation, that they will spread anti-COVID disinformation. If we look at the trace and the timeline of the accounts that are doing this, the people that are doing this, and the news outlets that are doing this, they've spread disinformation in the past. And that is almost universally, almost always true when it comes to these breaking news situations. On a more granular level, we see that image and video-based disinformation is very effective. Fake news stories exist, and sometimes they are powerful, but it is much more powerful to take a photo or a video and say this did not happen, or this happened at the wrong time. Finally, a lot of disinformation is done for political gain. A lot of it is done for financial gain, yes, but ultimately it's done for political gain by politicians. Those are general themes, and again, it's really difficult to generalize a problem that is so, it's all around the world, right? And it's very global. The last thing that I'll say, particularly with Western social media companies, their lack of enforcement has been really a disaster for disinformation. So any country, whether it's Facebook, any country where there's YouTube, any country where there's Instagram or TikTok or Twitter has had struggles with how these companies moderate disinformation. And the reason for that is because they don't moderate disinformation in non-English speaking markets as well as they moderate disinformation in English speaking markets. So of course they have global fact-checking partners, but they have many more partners in North America or Western countries than they do in other regions. And that is a problem. In terms of, I'm not an expert in Chinese social media, and I don't know, I can't speak to moderation there, but in terms of Western social media companies, that is the other pattern that we see with all of, almost all of these situations.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Jane. And the next one will be Zheng Qinghao or Zheng Qinghao. Sorry, I think Mr. Zheng or Ms. Zheng asked those questions pretty earlier, but I just missed that. So are you still there? Would you please turn on your microphone? Okay, maybe I can read the questions, and his question is, oh, okay, he is from our Facebook, so he can answer the question. Sorry, so he just left the message there. So his question is, how do you push your voice outside the echoing chambers? For example, the PPL who are not pro-Ukraine at the beginning, but do not usually look for the legitimacy of a piece of information?
A very complicated question, but I will do my best to answer it. There are things that are helpful and are not helpful. So one of the things is that if a particular community is so dedicated to the disinformation that they consume, it is not very helpful to try to get accurate information to them. What I mean by that is when I talked during the presentation about we don't know how effective accurate information is at getting to Russians and what that means, that is part of it. The other part of it is, for example, in the US, there is a big community called QAnon, right, which is a very big conspiracy. And we know that even if they read a fact check or two, their relationship with traditional journalism is so adversarial that it will not be helpful, and in fact might lead to harassment or spamming messages, or other sort of unpleasant online encounters. So we don't know the best way to target those communities, and we don't know the effect that fact checks have on those communities long term. But we do know that fact checks have an effect, and this is where a distribution point is specifically very important. So this is something that I mentioned earlier, which is it's really important to come to your audience instead of wait for your audience to come to you. What this means is that using the social media that your audience is using, and not just dropping a link to your article, but talking to them, explain to them what this article is about, or how it came together, or bring out the most interesting information. I will give you a specific example, which is that Telegram has been an absolutely huge social media network for Ukrainians, but it's not a big social media network in the West. And so what many Western news outlets have done is they created official Telegram channels so that they can reach Ukrainian audiences on Telegram with accurate information from their news outlets. The New York Times has done this, the Washington Post has done this, the BBC has been doing it for many years. And so with Ukraine, it's really a combination of going to those platforms and also Ukrainians telling very personal stories, talking about how this war has affected them, that has been able to really reach the people who maybe sometimes don't read the news, or maybe we're not sure what to think about it. That is, I think, the best that we can do. But the biggest piece of advice is don't wait for your audience to come to you. Do your best to come to your audience.
Thank you. And then the next question is from Professor Hong Zhenlin. Hong Zhenlin 老师 is the hi Zhenlin 老师.
Hi.
Okay. So you are sit outside.
No, not really. Yeah, but it's the Taipei, the mountains in Taipei. Just give Jane a kind of feeling that you sit in Taipei with us.
Oh, that's a very good idea. So maybe next time we need to try this. And Hong Zhenlin 老师, would you please introduce yourself and ask your question to Jane?
Okay, I'm Zhenlin Hong. Now I work in Graduate School of Journalism in National Taiwan University, and a lot of good friends from TFC and the circle of fact checking and in Taiwan. So of course, first of all, I want to thank Jane for your insightful speech, and very sorry about what happened in Ukraine. My question is kind of general, because when we look into the information or disinformation ecosystem, of course, there are a lot of stakeholders. And you talk about a lot about social media and the group of people who are behind this information, want to manipulate the information to get their interest. And there are, of course, other stakeholders. I think they're very important. First of all, is the mainstream media. Because in Taiwan, of course, we think our mainstream media in terms of their, performance of journalism, a lot of room to improve. And when we look at the mainstream media in the United States, of course, it's becoming partisan and sensational. And maybe sometimes they are the, source and the improver of misinformation and the disinformation. So what's the role of mainstream media, in this ecosystem? What is your observation and your suggestions? And another stakeholder is very, very important nowadays is the state and the government. And from your share, of course, the government is, they is the main force of information manipulation. But at the same time, from the constitutional human rights, the government has the obligation to maintain a healthy media system and the environment for the people's human rights. So what do you think of the role of the government, especially from the democracy and the human rights standard? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Thank you for showing me the mountains. The role of mainstream media is that they legitimize a lot of information. And whether that information is correct or incorrect, they are seen as somebody who is respected. And sometimes they provide false narratives. This is something that was very clear in the lead up to the invasion, the February 24th invasion of Ukraine, where Western news outlets tried to, explain the war, but without any kind of understanding of what was happening. So really just presenting a completely false picture. After the invasion, that changed, and there was a real split between news outlets who had their reporters on the ground, and those reporters on the ground generally did a pretty wonderful job, although, of course, there were some mistakes that have been made. And commentators who were back home, who were attempting to explain the war without having been to Ukraine or without understanding Ukrainian history, in which case they sometimes repeated false talking points or spread inaccurate information. We see a lot of that again. That kind of subsided at the beginning of the war. We see it come back up again now 100 days in. Particularly as many news outlets are pulling reporters out of Ukraine for a break or changing them over. And the last thing that I'll say is that most of the media, Western media ecosystem, has a very large presence on social media. So these stakeholders that you described, they all interact with one another. And we do sometimes see real legitimate reporters amplify false information, not in their journalism, but on their social media, without correcting it or without any acknowledging it in any way. Sometimes it's never okay, but sometimes people don't pay as much attention as they do now. But with a topic of this gravity, it is it's always damaging, particularly to Western audiences who don't know a lot about Ukraine and who have a big knowledge gap that needs to be filled. If you're asking me how we fix it, I don't know, one step at a time. But I would say that particularly the thing that has been encouraging is news outlets sending reporters on the ground, and also Ukrainian reporters trying to provide counter narratives to those Western mistakes. So that has been a really interesting dynamic to watch, where a news outlet will post something that is false, and Ukrainians will use social media to correct that falsehood in a very significant way. With government, it's even more difficult. And I would even say it depends on which government you're looking at, really. The Ukrainian government has taken a very proactive strategic perspective, where for the most part, they've decided that their job is communicating accurate information, lobbying Western governments, and trying to amplify what is actually happening on the ground. There have been some mistakes that have been made, but generally, I would say that Zelensky and his government have stepped into this role pretty successfully. That is, of course, different from the Russian government, which we've already spoken about, which is using the UN, both in-person speeches and public accounts to legitimize false information. And so the role of government is really the role of a megaphone. And it works in two ways. One is that if a government official says something, the media has to report on it. Whether it's accurate or inaccurate, the media has to report on it. And by having to report on it, sometimes false information or inaccurate information gets amplified. We saw this a lot in the US with Trump, right? Where Trump would say something that is completely false, and the media had to pay attention to it because he was the president, and so it would expose new audiences to that message. At the same time, if the government is spreading accurate information, it also goes a lot further. It's really difficult to quantify the role of governments in disinformation specifically. Of course, every campaign is different, and also the degree of trust in government matters a lot. If the degree of trust in government in Ukraine before the war was high for Ukraine, but generally pretty low, Zelensky's approval rating was something like 20 or 30% in Ukraine. Now the level of trust is high, right? Now his approval rating is somewhere in the 80s or even 90s, if I remember correctly. So all that is to say, maybe to wrap up, is that media manipulation life cycle model that I presented to you accounts for the role of media and the role of government in the disinformation ecosystem. And so you're really right to ask this question, because we need to account for that role as well. And that role is going to be different each time.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. And thank you, Professor Hongzhen Li. And also, the next question will be from Yu Hui, Professor Yu Hui. And Yu Hui, would you please introduce yourself briefly and say hello to Jane?
Yes, hello, Jane, and thanks for TFC for organizing this event. And thank you for your wonderful speech. Now people call it a new Cold War era, in which the main rivals are the United States and China. So I'm wondering, what kind of role do China play in this time? For example, nowadays many Chinese people, they think Russia take back Ukraine is justified, it's okay. And so what kind of impact? Will that have impact on international opinion, or will it spread out and influence other countries? That's my question. I'm wondering about your observation. Thank you. And now I'm a associate professor in National Yangming Jiaotong University, and I'm also interested in the China, Taiwan, and the United States, the international relationship and communication technology, and also cultural activism. Like, what can we do to fight back this kind of new fascism?
Thank you for your question, and you might be able to answer it better than I can, but I will do my best.
Thank you. Yeah.
The informational role that China plays on Western audiences is, I think, multifaceted. On one hand, China, of course, is seen as, the bad guy. There's a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in the West, and I would say that sentiment has been fueled by both people on the right, particularly Steve Bannon's supporters and Trump's supporters, but also the mainstream, because there was such vast support for Hong Kong during the Hong Kong protests and the Hong Kong Revolution. I would say that sentiment has been really bolstered by the Milk Tea Alliance online, right, which spoke to a lot of online audiences through the use of memes and other creative ways of social media. And all of that, I think, in this situation, means that China's role in the war is sort of understood very skeptically. So early on, everybody was wondering whether China will specifically support Russia or whether it will try to stay neutral. And we know that China is giving different messages to different audiences. And Chinese diplomats are giving different messages to different audiences. I don't know what that will mean in the long term. I won't pretend to be somebody who understands China very intimately. But I do also know that one factor is that China has invested a lot into Ukraine as well, into building up Ukrainian infrastructure financially and through lobbying. How that impacts the war overall, I think, is an open question. But although the sentiment that you describe among the Chinese people is present, it is also true that on the international stage, China did not come out and say we are supporting Russia unconditionally in no other way, and in nothing else, because it seems like they also still need Western support, even though the Western outlook on China is so negative. I don't know if that really answers your question. That's really my best understanding right now. I wish I had a more nuanced outlook on China, Russia, Ukraine, US relation. But I do think that it's going to be a very important relationship, particularly as we enter the stage of the war where global attention recedes from Ukraine. And support for Russia can be a little bit more proactive from the countries who support Russia. So I think we will maybe see some movement in the coming weeks and months, but I don't want to pretend to know what the future will be like.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. And we still have 2 minutes to finish this panel. And we have 2 other messages from the audience. And the first one is from Cho Chen. I'm sorry if I have the wrong pronunciation. And he or she say, you highlight the teamwork is the key to online fact-checking. In addition to co-sharing sheets, pictures, and videos, could you share some ways how fact-checking center work with other organizations, such as human rights groups for fighting the spread of disinformation? And the other is also from the message, our Facebook message. And Mr. Chen Yongfu said, actually, in the Chinese-speaking world, Taiwan's always got the information, misinformation or disinformation from China, and those disinformation emphasize. Actually, they stand Russia's. They are pro-Russia, and also they want to realize those special military action. And also, Taiwan has lots of pro-China people. They think the invasion is not an invasion; it's a inner war. So. Do you think in the democracy country, how do we tackle the disinformation during this very complicated situation? Because actually we are facing an enemy, but because the democracy, so it will just like pretend it's kind of opinion, it's different of political opinion or political positions. So those are 2 questions from the audience. And after those questions, COFAX, the founders of COFAX will share, Bilin will share his insight and idea about your sharing. Okay, so would you please answer the question, and the Bilin will be the last audience to raise his ideas or questions.
Yes, I will try to answer these questions quickly because I know we're right at time. In terms of working with human rights organizations, I would say think about them as sources if you're a reporter. Ask them what they see on the ground, check your information against their information. If there's evidence that they've gathered that can be useful to you, just talk to them and see if they would be willing to share it, or they're willing to help you understand what is happening. In terms of the different opinions within the country, there was a lot of pro-Russian sentiment in Ukraine as well, even after the 2014 invasion. That changed on February 24th because when you feel what it is to be bombed, your outlook changes a lot. But it is important to be honest about the different parts of society that have different opinions, and to discuss those opinions in a way that is not aggressive and not confrontational, but tries to understand where they come from and why they come from there. Any democracy and any society will have people with different ideas, different thoughts. It is important to not ignore that. It's important to talk about that and figure out if there is a middle ground. But like I said, in the case of Ukraine, when bombs started falling, not only did people change their outlook on Russia overall, many Ukrainians even stopped speaking Russian and switched to Ukrainian and have completely changed their attitudes. So that has been our experience. I will also, since I know we're wrapping up, just say thank you to Summer for the translation and for moderating and for having me, and to TFC for hosting such an interesting conversation. It has been wonderful to speak to all of you. And if there's any more questions that you have, please reach out. I will always be happy to hear from you, and I will always be happy to help.
Okay, and thank you, Jane. And Billy, would you like to share your ideas?
Hi, Jan. That you're sharing is really inspiring. I really thank you. Also, thanks to Summer. In my point of view, Taiwan, like us, we call it the collaborate co-fact checking. So actually, it is open source project, and we use a lot of the open source intelligence to establish this fact checking chatbot. Once you forward this information to the chatbot will reply the fact check report automatically. So I'm wondering that what's your opinion that in a global society, how people can help each other if they use this kind of open source intelligence, for example, open data, open source, source code, for example, CoFast really happy to share our open source code to the global. For example, like in Thailand, they use the source code to establish another fact check chatbot in Thai as well. We wonder, would that happen if we use this kind of collaboration with the global society and have this kind of fact check community with everyone, for example, like Ukraine, for example, for US, or to help each other, especially for those in need. Thank
you. I can't answer what will happen because I wish I could, but I think just like open source communities over the last 8 years have come together to gather information and distribute information and be much more effective at what they do, fact-checking communities have begun and are doing the same. And I think that altogether gives us more power, gives our journalism more power, and also gives truth and accurate information more power. Collaboration is, it's not always possible. We're all very competitive. But at the same time, it is something that is very empowering, and that I hope will be a trend that continues in the future, because sharing lessons with each other means we don't have to learn them ourselves. So I encourage all collaborations, and I really hope that more of them will come in the future.
Okay, thank you for all of you participate in those panel, and thank you, Jane, to share those insights to us. I think Jane's observation and including the efforts during the war, I think that's pretty give us very many inspirations and to gear us up. And also I want we just want to emphasize the war is still going on, so there are still many things that we can do, just like the questions from the audience, how Jane tackled the misinformation against Russia is also the same way we are going to tackle disinformation from China. And those two actors has the same way. Before we just do our own stuff, and we didn't collaborate or communicate together. So during this war, it's a very good connection between Ukraine and Taiwan, and especially between Jane and us. So I think it's a very good sharing, and it's a very good beginning for us to know each other, and we can in the near future we can work together and make more efforts, and maybe there are some collaborations or some co-workers that we can do in the future after we got those information, very precious informations from Jane. And also I think Jane is pretty good at investigating, do the vision investigations, and also do the research on disinformation. So I think Jane is pretty welcome to everyone to just contact with her if you got any information. So we will send Jane's PowerPoint after those meeting, and also Jane will leave his contact information to all of you. Thank you, Jane.